October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular English crispness that promised frost before morning. The ancient bells of St. Mary's Church called the faithful to evensong, their bronze voices carrying across the village green where the last of the autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the old oak trees. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her worn but well-maintained coat as she made her way along the familiar path, her keen blue eyes noting the small changes that marked the season's progression. Mrs. Bantry's chrysanthemums had finally succumbed to the cold, and young Dr. Haydock's motor car bore a thin film of frost on its windscreen. St. Mary's was fuller than usual for an evening service, though Miss Marple suspected this had less to do with sudden spiritual devotion than with curiosity about the village's newest resident. Lady Cordelia Ashworth had taken the lease on Rose Cottage 6 weeks prior, and her arrival had provided St. Mary Mead with its most intriguing topic of conversation since the unfortunate incident with the Church Restoration Fund 2 summers past. Miss Marple settled into her customary pew, 3 rows from the front on the left side, positioning herself where she could observe the congregation without appearing to do so. It was a skill honed over decades of village life, the art of seeing everything while seeming to see nothing at all. Her knitting bag rested beside her, containing the pale blue wool she was working into a shawl for her great-niece, though tonight the needles remained still. Lady Ashworth had chosen a seat in the back corner, partially obscured by one of the Norman pillars that had supported this sacred space for over 8 centuries. She was an elegant woman in her early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair that spoke of expensive styling. Her navy coat was beautifully cut, and she wore a small hat with a half veil that cast delicate shadows across features that retained their handsome lines despite the passage of years. There was something about her posture, alert yet withdrawn, that reminded Miss Marple of a cat in an unfamiliar garden, ready to flee at Reverend Clement, elderly and gentle, began the evening service with his usual measured cadence. His voice, though not as strong as it once had been, still carried the comfort of familiar ritual. Miss Marple found herself dividing her attention between the liturgy and the small human dramas playing out around her. Colonel Bantry sat ramrod straight in his front pew, but his ears had taken on a distinctly pink hue whenever Lady Ashworth's name had been mentioned in recent weeks. Mrs. Price, the village's self-appointed social coordinator, kept stealing glances toward the back of the church with barely concealed curiosity. Most intriguing was the behavior of Miss Letitia Blacklock, the retired postmistress who sat across the aisle. Miss Blacklock had been observing Lady Ashworth throughout the service, but these were not the frank, curious looks of the other parishioners. Instead, there was something almost furtive about her attention, as if she were trying to confirm something she hoped might not be true. The congregation rose for the Magnificat, their voices joining in the ancient words of praise. It was during the transition to the Nunc Dimittis that Miss Marple noticed Lady Ashworth's subtle movement. The lady slipped from her pew with practiced discretion, moving toward the small side door that led to the vestry garden, a space typically used by the flower committee and the occasional parishioner seeking a moment of private reflection. The movement was so carefully timed and executed that Miss Marple doubted anyone else had observed it. Lady Ashworth had waited for the moment when all heads were bowed, all attention focused on prayer books and familiar words. Miss Marple continued her prayers, but a small part of her mind filed away this observation with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades noting the small inconsistencies in human behavior. As the prayers concluded and Reverend Clement began his gentle homily on the parable of the lost sheep, Miss Marple found herself glancing occasionally toward the vestry door. It was perfectly reasonable for someone to step out during service. Perhaps Lady Ashworth felt unwell or needed a moment of air. Yet something about the careful timing and the deliberate choice of the less conspicuous exit suggested this was not a casual departure. The service drew toward its close with the final prayers and blessing. Miss Marple realized with a small start that Lady Ashworth had not returned. The congregation rose for the concluding hymn, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended." their voices lifted in the familiar melody that had marked the close of countless evenings in this ancient place. Still no sign of the lady in the navy coat. As the final Amen echoed through the stone arches and the congregation began to file out in the leisurely manner of people with nowhere urgent to be on a Sunday evening, Miss Marple lingered. She ostensibly examined the harvest decorations that Mrs. Price had arranged with military precision, but actually watched for any sign of Lady Ashworth's return. "Lovely service, wasn't it, Miss Marple?" Reverend Clement approached with his gentle smile, though there was something slightly strained about his usual composure. "Indeed it was, Reverend," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I was wondering, though, did you happen to notice Lady Ashworth leave during the prayers? I do hope she wasn't feeling unwell." The elderly vicar's brow creased with confusion. "Lady Ashworth, but surely she remained for the entire service. I could have sworn I saw her in the back pew during the final blessing." Miss Marple felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. She had been watching that back corner of the church quite carefully, and she was certain that Lady Ashworth had not returned. Yet Reverend Clement seemed equally certain that he had seen her there at the service's end. It was then that Mrs. Price's voice cut through the gentle murmur of departing parishioners. "Has anyone seen Lady Ashworth's gloves? She's left them in her pew." The church warden's wife held up a pair of elegant kid gloves, pale grey with pearl buttons, "and her prayer book is still here, open to the evening prayers." A small crowd gathered around the back pew. There, neatly arranged as if their owner had merely stepped away for a moment, were the gloves, the prayer book, and a delicate lace handkerchief with the initial C embroidered in one corner. But of Lady Cordelia Ashworth herself, there was no trace. "Perhaps she stepped out to the garden for air," suggested Dr. Haydock, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Miss Blacklock, who had remained silent throughout the discovery, suddenly spoke up. "The garden gate leads directly to the lane behind the church. If she felt unwell, she might have gone straight home that way." But even as the explanations were offered, Miss Marple noticed the small details that others missed. The prayer book was open to the exact page they had been reading when Lady Ashworth disappeared, the Nunc Dimittis. A faint impression on the page suggested it had been pressed by something damp. On the wooden pew rail, barely visible in the dim evening light, was a small smear of what looked like mud, still fresh. As the congregation finally dispersed into the October night, their voices carrying speculation and concern across the village green, Miss Marple remained in the empty church for a few moments longer. The candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. Somewhere between the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, between one prayer and the next, Lady Cordelia Ashworth had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. And Miss Marple had the uncomfortable feeling that before this beautiful October evening was over, the mystery of the lady's disappearance would prove to be far more complicated than a simple case of someone stepping out for air. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that when people vanished between prayers, they rarely reappeared without bringing secrets with them. The evening mist was beginning to rise from the churchyard as Miss Marple finally made her way home, her mind already turning over the small, seemingly insignificant details that others had overlooked. In the morning, she suspected, St. Mary Mead would wake to find that their quiet village life had been irrevocably changed by whatever had happened in those few minutes between two ancient prayers. By morning, the October mist had lifted from St. Mary Mead, but in its place hung something far more persistent, the electric atmosphere of a village consumed by mystery. The news of Lady Ashworth's disappearance had spread with a peculiar velocity that only genuine scandal can achieve, reaching every cottage and corner shop before the milk had been delivered. Miss Marple discovered this when Mrs. Bantry arrived at her door shortly after 8 o'clock. Her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of haste, and her eyes bright with the particular excitement that comes from being first with momentous news. Over hastily prepared tea and buttered scones, Mrs. Bantry revealed that she had encountered Mrs. Price outside the post office at dawn, where the church warden's wife had been pacing with the determined air of someone waiting for the first available audience. According to Mrs. Price's breathless account, she had returned to the church at 6 in the morning to collect forgotten hymnals, only to find Reverend Clement already there, examining the vestry garden with the methodical attention of a man searching for answers he hoped not to find. The good Reverend had confided his sleepless night of worry and his discovery of disturbing details. The garden gate that should have been propped open with Mr. Pottle's watering can stood wide and unlatched, and clear footprints marked the soft earth of the herb garden. Not just the neat impressions of Lady Ashworth's well-made shoes, but larger, heavier prints that suggested someone else had been present during her mysterious departure. The morning's expedition to the village shop provided Miss Marple with a comprehensive survey of local opinion, each theory reflecting more about its proponent than about the missing lady. Mrs. Price, dispensing sugar with a liberal helping of conjecture, declared with absolute conviction that Lady Ashworth had been no ordinary resident, but likely a spy or someone involved in shady foreign business, forced to disappear when circumstances became too dangerous. Young Dr. Haydock, encountering Miss Marple outside the shop, offered a more medical perspective, suggesting amnesia brought on by a sudden shock or fall, though he admitted with professional honesty that the complete absence of any trace defied his clinical experience. Mr. Wither, the retired solicitor, applied his legal mind to the problem and concluded that the disappearance was too complete to be accidental, suggesting deliberate action either by Lady Ashworth herself or by someone else entirely. The most intriguing reaction came from Miss Letitia Blacklock, whom Miss Marple encountered by the village pond, ostensibly feeding the ducks, but clearly agitated beneath her composed exterior. Miss Blacklock offered what she called the simplest explanation, that Lady Ashworth had been a restless soul who found village life insufficiently stimulating and had simply departed on a whim, perhaps summoned by an old acquaintance or seized by wanderlust. But the way Miss Blacklock avoided direct eye contact and the slight tremor in her voice as she scattered breadcrumbs suggested that her simple theory masked a far more complex understanding of the situation. There was something almost defensive in her manner, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as her listener. Tommy Jackson, the boy who sang alto in the choir and possessed an insatiable appetite for adventure, contributed what might prove to be the most significant observation of all. He had seen a sleek black motor car with London registration plates idling near the hedge in the back lane before evensong, its polished bonnet gleaming even in the dim evening light. This detail sent ripples of speculation through the gathered villagers. Mrs. Price immediately declared it must belong to a journalist, while Mr. Pottle insisted with wounded dignity that no journalists came to St. Mary Mead uninvited, and he certainly had invited none. Dr. Haydock's professional visit to Rose Cottage had yielded more questions than answers. The house appeared undisturbed, with no signs of hasty departure, yet Lady Ashworth had clearly not returned after the church service. Her evening coat hung in the hall closet, her handbag rested on the entrance table, and most peculiarly, her house key had been found positioned deliberately on the kitchen windowsill, as if placed there by someone who wanted it to be easily discovered. A cup of tea sat cold and untouched on the counter, its surface bearing the thin film that indicated it had been poured many hours earlier. Reverend Clement's afternoon visit to Miss Marple revealed the depth of his distress over the incident. The elderly clergyman, usually a beacon of pastoral calm, seemed genuinely shaken by the idea that someone had vanished from the sanctity of his church. He confessed to replaying the evening service endlessly in his mind, searching for some overlooked detail or fleeting expression that might provide a clue, but finding nothing until Mrs. Price's discovery of the abandoned gloves and prayer book. Through all the speculation and theorizing, Miss Marple moved quietly through the village, collecting information with the methodical precision of someone gathering drop stitches in a complex knitting pattern. She noted the inconsistencies that others overlooked, the damp impression on the prayer book page, the mud smear on the pew rail, the contradiction between the Reverend's certainty that he had seen Lady Ashworth at the service's end and the physical evidence of her earlier departure. Most significantly, she observed the subtle patterns in human behavior that revealed as much about the observers as about the observed. The village, having exhausted its initial theories, now settled into a state of anxious anticipation, waiting for the next development, while remaining unaware that Miss Marple had already begun her own quiet investigation. The morning had transformed St. Mary Mead from a peaceful English village into a community grappling with its own hidden fears and unspoken truths, all brought to the surface by the mysterious disappearance of one elegant lady who had vanished between two ancient prayers. The morning after Lady Ashworth's disappearance brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, his arrival marked by the sort of methodical efficiency that immediately transformed the village's amateur speculation into something more serious and official. Miss Marple observed his systematic examination of both the church and Rose Cottage from her strategic position outside the post office, where she appeared to be engaged in nothing more pressing than working on her pale blue knitting while enjoying the weak October sunshine. Inspector Slack, a competent man in his middle years who approached mysteries with systematic thoroughness rather than brilliant intuition, quickly formed the preliminary conclusion that Lady Ashworth had staged her own disappearance, possibly to escape debts or unwelcome entanglements, using the church service as convenient cover for a prearranged departure, with an accomplice waiting in the mysterious black motor car that young Tommy Jackson had observed. Miss Marple found this theory logical but incomplete, lacking the subtle understanding of human nature that her long experience had taught her to value above purely rational explanations. During her seemingly casual morning visit with Mrs. Bantry, she learned details that complicated Inspector Slack's straightforward assessment considerably. Lady Ashworth had paid 6 months' rent in advance on Rose Cottage and had recently ordered a substantial quantity of coal for the winter, hardly the actions of someone planning immediate departure. More significantly, she had made an appointment with the village dressmaker for alterations to be completed before the harvest festival, suggesting someone who anticipated remaining in St. Mary Mead for the foreseeable future. These small domestic arrangements painted a picture of settled intention rather than preparation for flight. Her afternoon visit to the church, ostensibly to admire Mrs. Price's autumn arrangements, provided Miss Marple with opportunities for closer observation that had been impossible during the previous evening's confusion. The vestry garden still bore clear evidence of recent activity, including the heavier footprints that Mr. Pottle had discovered, which were neither Lady Ashworth's delicate impressions nor the sturdy boots of a local farmer, but rather the marks of a man's dress shoe, slightly worn but well maintained. The mud smear on the pew rail, when examined more carefully in daylight, proved to be the same dark, rich soil from the garden, confirming that whoever had left it had been outside very recently. Most intriguingly, the damp impression on the prayer book page carried a faint metallic scent, reminiscent of old brass or well-used gardening tools, suggesting contact with something more significant than mere moisture. Dr. Haydock's second, more thorough examination of Rose Cottage had yielded discoveries that cast the entire mystery in a different light. His medical training had detected what Inspector Slack's cursory search had missed: a small quantity of blood on the kitchen floor near the back door, minimal enough to be overlooked as a cooking accident, but fresh enough to have occurred within the past day. Additionally, he had found a fragment of navy blue wool caught on a rose thorn in the back garden, apparently matching Lady Ashworth's church coat perfectly. These physical traces suggested that her disappearance might not have been as voluntary as initially assumed, and that whatever had happened might have begun at Rose Cottage rather than the church. Miss Marple's encounter with Miss Blacklock near the church gates proved particularly illuminating, though not in ways the retired postmistress intended. Miss Blacklock, usually precise and composed, displayed an agitation that seemed disproportionate to her claimed casual acquaintance with the missing woman. Her insistence that Lady Ashworth was simply a free spirit who had decided to leave carried the vehemence of someone trying to convince herself rather than her listener. When Miss Marple gently mentioned the elegance of Lady Ashworth's possessions, Miss Blacklock's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by nervous comments about how difficult it was to judge people by appearances in modern times. The careful arrangement of evidence at Rose Cottage continued to puzzle Miss Marple's methodical mind. The house key positioned deliberately on the kitchen window-sill suggested not hasty departure, but careful staging, designed to create the impression that Lady Ashworth might return at any moment. This was a message, but for whom was it intended? Similarly, the absence of any photographs in the cottage, leaving only pale rectangles in the dust where frames had once stood, suggested someone who had deliberately erased traces of her past before settling in St. Mary Mead. As evening approached and Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her knitting, she reflected on the accumulated details of the investigation. The village's various theories each contained fragments of truth, but none adequately explained the complete picture that was emerging. Lady Ashworth had clearly been a woman with secrets, but whether those secrets had led to voluntary flight or something more sinister remained to be determined. The mysterious motor car, the blood and torn fabric, Miss Blacklock's peculiar anxiety, and Reverend Clement's confused memory of seeing Lady Ashworth at the service's end all suggested a complexity that went far beyond simple explanations. Miss Marple understood that when people vanished so completely, they usually took with them answers to questions others had been afraid to ask, and she suspected that before this mystery was resolved, St. Mary Mead would be forced to confront truths carefully buried beneath its placid surface. By the third morning, Inspector Slack's methodical investigation had crystallized around a primary suspect whose arrival in St. Mary Mead now seemed far too coincidental to dismiss. Mr. Julian Rivers, a man in his late 40s with the kind of practiced charm that immediately aroused suspicion in a village where genuine warmth was easily distinguished from its calculated imitation, had appeared at the local inn just 2 days before Lady Ashworth's disappearance. His explanation for this timing, a business matter requiring urgent discussion with Lady Ashworth, struck Inspector Slack as conveniently vague, particularly when Rivers proved unable to provide specific details about the nature of their supposed business relationship. The discovery of blood stains on the church steps, initially missed in the evening shadows but clearly visible in the morning light, had prompted a more thorough examination of the entire area, yielding a silk scarf of expensive London manufacture caught on the cemetery railings and bearing the distinctive navy and silver pattern that matched Lady Ashworth's ensemble perfectly. Dr. Haydock's confirmation that the stains were indeed human blood, though not in quantities suggesting fatal injury, transformed the investigation from a missing person case into something far more serious, while the pattern of the stains suggested movement rather than a stationary struggle, indicating that someone had been wounded but mobile during whatever confrontation had occurred. Rivers's black motor car, matching young Tommy Jackson's description perfectly, provided the physical link that Inspector Slack required, while the man's inability to account precisely for his movements during the crucial period of Lady Ashworth's disappearance only strengthened the case against him. His alibi consisted of a solitary walk through the fields, followed by dinner at the inn, but the proprietor could confirm only his general presence during the evening, not his specific whereabouts during the church service. When pressed about his relationship with Lady Ashworth, Rivers spoke with an emotional tone that struck several observers as theatrical rather than genuine, describing her as a dear friend while displaying none of the natural grief one might expect from someone truly concerned about a missing companion. Inspector Slack's systematic approach had also uncovered Rivers' financial difficulties through discreet inquiries in London, revealing a man with expensive tastes and limited means, precisely the sort who might view a wealthy widow as an opportunity rather than a friend. Miss Blacklock's behavior throughout the investigation continued to puzzle Miss Marple. whose quiet observations from her position tending the memorial garden provided an excellent vantage point for watching both the official proceedings and the reactions of her fellow villagers. The retired postmistress displayed an agitation that seemed disproportionate to her claimed casual acquaintance with the missing lady, and her insistence on Lady Ashworth's restless nature carried the vehemence of someone trying to convince herself as much as her listeners. When Inspector Slack questioned her about her obvious attention to Lady Ashworth during the church service, Miss Blacklock reluctantly admitted to recognizing the lady from years past, when she had been known as Cordelia Barton and had served as companion in a grand house in Brighton where some unpleasant business involving jewelry had occurred. This revelation provided another potential motive for the disappearance, suggesting that Lady Ashworth might have been fleeing not just Rivers, but also recognition of a scandalous past that someone might have threatened to expose. The evidence at Rose Cottage continued to suggest careful staging rather than hasty departure, with the house key positioned deliberately on the kitchen windowsill and personal items arranged as if their owner intended to return momentarily. Dr. Haydock's more thorough examination had revealed additional disturbing details. A small amount of blood near the back door and a fragment of navy wool caught on a rose thorn in the garden, both consistent with a struggle that had begun at the cottage before moving to the church. Inspector Slack's theory now encompassed a scenario in which Rivers had confronted Lady Ashworth at her home, possibly about money or blackmail, leading to a violent altercation that continued when she fled to the church seeking sanctuary. The vestry garden's heavy footprints, matching Rivers's well-made city shoes, supported this reconstruction of events, while the careful arrangement of her belongings in the church pew suggested either a final gesture of defiance or an attempt to leave clues for those who might follow. Miss Marple's evening visit to the church, ostensibly to return a mislaid prayer book, provided her with opportunities for closer examination that had been impossible during the initial confusion. Her methodical inspection of Lady Ashworth's abandoned possessions revealed details that the official investigation had overlooked in its focus on the more dramatic evidence. The prayer book bore not only the damp impression that had initially caught her attention, but also a faint metallic scent that reminded her of brass polish, while the elegant kid gloves showed signs of careful handling rather than the damage one might expect from a violent struggle. Most significantly, she observed that the brass vase in the south transept had been moved slightly from its usual position, leaving a faint mark on the stone windowsill beneath, and the polishing cloth showed traces of recent use despite Mrs. Price's certainty that the altar brass had been cleaned on Saturday afternoon by young Mavis Clegg under proper supervision. These small inconsistencies troubled Miss Marple more than the obvious evidence that had convinced Inspector Slack of Rivers's guilt, for they suggested a complexity that the straightforward theory of confrontation and abduction could not adequately explain. If Rivers had indeed attacked Lady Sarndsey Ashworth in a moment of desperation or anger, why would anyone have taken time to polish brass or arrange personal items with such deliberate care? The staging at both Rose Cottage and the church implied calculation rather than passion, planning rather than spontaneous violence, and Miss Marple's long experience had taught her that when evidence appeared too convenient, it usually concealed rather than revealed the truth behind a crime. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that transformed the entire investigation when Mr. Geoffrey Thornton arrived from London in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, seeking urgent consultation with Inspector Slack about Lady Ashworth's disappearance. As her solicitor, Mr. Thornton possessed information that cast the mystery in an entirely different light, revealing that the quiet widow who had sought anonymity in St. Mary Mead was actually the sole heir to the substantial Ashworth estate, including properties worth several £100,000 scattered across England, Scotland, and the West Indies. More significantly, Lady Ashworth had been receiving threatening letters for months from someone claiming to be her late husband's illegitimate son, demanding recognition and a substantial portion of the inheritance. Threats that had become increasingly specific and menacing until they drove her to seek the safety of village obscurity, while Thornton's investigators attempted to trace their source. This revelation transformed Rivers from a simple fortune hunter into potentially something far more dangerous, particularly when Thornton revealed that the threatening letters demonstrated intimate knowledge of the Ashworth family's private affairs, including details that could only have been obtained through inside sources or sophisticated criminal connections. The mysterious claimant had somehow acquired copies of Sir Reginald Ashworth's will, personal correspondence, and even family photographs, suggesting either a legitimate connection to the family or access to their most confidential legal documents. Inspector Slack immediately expanded his investigation to include inquiries about any unusual strangers observed in the area, while Thornton provided descriptions of known associates of the letter writer, including individuals who might drive expensive motor cars and possessed the sort of refined appearance that would allow them to blend into respectable society. Miss Marple's careful examination of the physical evidence took on new significance in light of these revelations, particularly her discovery of a small silver locket wedged beneath one of the ancient pews during Reverend Clement's thorough search of the sanctuary. The locket contained a photograph of a handsome young man in military uniform bearing a striking resemblance to Sir Reginald Ashworth, along with an inscription reading, "To my dearest Cordelia, until we meet again, R. H." The initials and the obvious age of the photograph suggested a connection to Lady Ashworth's past that predated her marriage, raising questions about relationships and secrets that might have provided additional motives for her disappearance. Most intriguingly, the locket had been deliberately placed beneath the pew rather than accidentally dropped, suggesting that Lady Ashworth or someone else had hidden it there purposefully, perhaps as a message for someone who would know where to look. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of a woman whose carefully constructed new life in St. Mary Mead had been shattered by the convergence of multiple threats from her past. Yet Miss Marple remained troubled by the small details that suggested the official theory, however logical, might be missing crucial elements of the truth. The careful staging of evidence, the deliberate placement of clues, and the almost theatrical nature of the disappearance all pointed toward a complexity that went beyond simple greed or revenge, hinting at secrets and relationships that the investigation had not yet uncovered. As evening settled over the village once again, Miss Marple reflected on the growing certainty that Lady Ashworth's vanishing between two prayers was only the beginning of a mystery that would require all her understanding of human nature to unravel completely. The fourth day brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had begun to sense that the mystery surrounding Lady Ashworth's disappearance contained layers of deception that went far deeper than anyone had initially imagined. Inspector Slack's methodical interrogation of Julian Rivers at the Much Benham police station had begun to crack the man's polished facade, revealing beneath it not the calculating criminal the inspector had expected, but rather a desperate individual whose financial ruin had driven him to increasingly questionable decisions. Rivers finally admitted to knowing Lady Ashworth from London society, acknowledging that he had indeed sought her out for a substantial loan that would prevent his complete financial collapse, but his vehement denials of any involvement in her disappearance carried the ring of genuine terror rather than calculated deception. When confronted with young Tommy Jackson's sighting of his black motorcar near the church lane, Rivers stammered through an unconvincing explanation about taking a wrong turn while seeking the main road. But his obvious lies seemed to stem from embarrassment about his desperate circumstances rather than guilt over a violent crime. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Miss Blacklock proved far more illuminating than the official interrogation, though the retired postmistress's revelations came wrapped in the nervous energy of someone struggling to maintain long-held secrets. Under the gentle pressure of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent questions about Brighton, Miss Blacklock finally admitted to a more substantial connection with Lady Ashworth's past than she had previously revealed. During her years as postmistress, she had indeed handled forwarding arrangements for someone named Cordelia Barton, and the abrupt cessation of those arrangements had coincided with unpleasant rumors about missing jewelry and sudden departures from respectable households. More significantly, Miss Blacklock's sister had worked briefly in the same Brighton establishment where Cordelia had served as companion, leaving suddenly when a valuable bracelet disappeared and was later discovered in a coal scuttle, placed there by someone who clearly intended its discovery to implicate the young companion. The matter had never reached the police, but the whispered accusations and damaged reputations had driven both women to seek employment elsewhere, carrying with them the lingering suspicion that justice had not been properly served. The discovery that Mavis Clegg had borrowed the church keys on Saturday afternoon introduced an entirely new dimension to the investigation, one that Inspector Slack had overlooked in his focus on the more obvious suspects. Mrs. Price's tearful confession that she had lent the keys to allow Mavis to show her young man the vestry garden created possibilities that transformed the careful staging of evidence from mysterious to potentially explicable. If Mavis and her Sam Durrant had access to the church before Lady Ashworth's disappearance, they could have prepared hiding places, arranged signals, or even planned the entire scenario that had so puzzled the investigators. Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed that Mavis's mother had once worked in Brighton for a lady who paid promptly but dismissed employees without explanation, while Sam's uncle drove for a London gentleman with business interests in the Caribbean, connections that seemed too coincidental to dismiss in light of the Ashworth family's extensive colonial holdings. The silver locket's significance grew more complex as village speculation attempted to identify the mysterious Arch, whose photograph it contained, though Miss Marple noticed that the various theories revealed as much about their proponents as about the evidence itself. Mr. Thornton's return to the village brought additional information about Sir Reginald Ashworth's complicated family history, including the existence of an estranged nephew named Robert Hastings, who had disappeared years earlier following a bitter inheritance dispute. This Robert Hastings matched the general description of the young man in the locket photograph, suggesting that Lady Ashworth might have carried a memento of her late husband's family rather than a romantic token from her own past. The possibility that the threatening letters came not from an illegitimate son, but from a disinherited nephew seeking to reclaim what he considered his rightful inheritance added new dimensions to the motives surrounding her disappearance. Miss Marple's careful re-examination of the physical evidence continued to trouble her methodical mind, particularly the theatrical quality of the crime scene staging that suggested calculation rather than passion. The deliberate placement of Lady Ashworth's gloves and prayer book, the careful positioning of the locket beneath the pew, and the almost convenient discovery of Julian Rivers' cufflink in the vestry garden all pointed towards someone who wanted the investigation to follow a specific path, rather than uncover the actual truth. Her long experience with human nature had taught her that when evidence appeared too perfectly arranged, it usually concealed rather than revealed the reality behind a crime, and she began to suspect that Lady Ashworth's disappearance might be the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan involving multiple participants rather than the work of a single desperate individual. The village's reaction to these accumulating revelations reflected the community's growing unease with the complexity that had emerged from what initially seemed a straightforward case of fortune hunting gone wrong. Colonel Bantry declared himself thoroughly confused by the proliferation of suspects and motives, while Dr. Haydock admitted that his medical training provided little guidance for understanding crimes that seemed to rely more on psychological manipulation than physical violence. Even Reverend Clement, still troubled by his confused memory of seeing Lady Ashworth at the service's conclusion, began to question whether his tired eyes had simply mistaken another woman in a dark coat for the missing lady, a possibility that opened disturbing questions about who might have deliberately taken her place in the back pew. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead once again, Miss Marple reflected on the growing certainty that the truth behind Lady Ashworth's disappearance lay not in the grand gestures and obvious clues that had captured everyone's attention, but in the small inconsistencies and carefully overlooked details that revealed the human motivations driving the mystery. The convergence of Julian Rivers's desperation, Miss Blacklock's guilty knowledge, the borrowed church keys, and the mysterious R.H. suggested a web of relationships and secrets that went far beyond simple explanations, while the theatrical staging of evidence indicated someone who understood both human psychology and the predictable patterns of official investigation. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had left behind not just an absence, but a carefully constructed puzzle that would require all of Miss Marple's understanding of human nature to solve, and she suspected that, before the mystery reached its conclusion, St. Mary Mead would be forced to confront truths about itself that had been carefully hidden beneath its placid surface for far longer than anyone cared to admit. The fifth morning brought a revelation that transformed the entire investigation when Inspector Slack received a telephone call that left him staring at the receiver in bewildered silence. The voice on the other end belonged to the real Mr. Geoffrey Thornton, calling from his chambers in Lincoln's Inn to inquire about urgent telegrams he had supposedly sent regarding Lady Ashworth's estate. The gentleman who had arrived in the Rolls-Royce provided intimate family details and left behind an embossed calling card, had vanished as completely as Lady Ashworth herself, taking with him not only his impressive motor car, but also several crucial documents from the case file that Inspector Slack now realized had been examined rather too thoroughly during their consultation. This discovery sent ripples of unease through the official investigation, forcing a complete reconsideration of evidence that had seemed so convincingly presented by someone who clearly possessed intimate knowledge of the Ashworth family's private affairs, yet had no legitimate connection to them whatsoever. Miss Marple learned of this development during her morning visit to the post office, where Mrs. Price dispensed the news along with stamps and speculation in equal measure. The revelation that they had all been deceived by an impostor skilled enough to fool even Inspector Slack created a new atmosphere of suspicion in the village, where residents now eyed each other with the uncomfortable awareness that someone among them possessed far more dangerous knowledge than anyone had suspected. The false solicitor's intimate familiarity with legal procedures and family history suggested either extensive criminal research or inside information obtained through sources that remained troublingly unclear. Most disturbing was the realization that this mysterious individual had been observing their investigation from the beginning, carefully guiding it toward conclusions that served his own unknown purposes. The morning also brought Mavis Clegg to Miss Marple's door, the young woman's usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress as she clutched a small brass key in her trembling fingers. Through gentle questioning that respected the girl's evident fear, Miss Marple learned that Mavis had made a discovery during her church cleaning duties that she had been too frightened to report to the authorities. Behind the altar, concealed within what appeared to be solid stone but was actually a cleverly constructed compartment, lay a collection of documents, jewelry, and personal effects that clearly did not belong to St. Mary's Church. The compartment, skillfully hidden during the Victorian Restoration when such modifications could be made without attracting attention, had been serving as a repository for valuable items over an extended period, possibly with the knowledge of previous church officials who had taken their secrets to their graves. Miss Blacklock's behavior throughout the morning provided Miss Marple with additional pieces of the puzzle that was slowly taking shape in her methodical mind. The retired postmistress displayed an agitation that went far beyond normal concern for a missing neighbor, and her repeated visits to various village locations suggested someone checking on arrangements or ensuring that evidence remained properly concealed. When Miss Marple encountered her near the church gates, ostensibly feeding the ducks but clearly watching for signs of official activity around the building, Miss Blacklock's nervous chatter revealed more than she intended about her familiarity with Lady Ashworth's past and her own role in events that stretched back far beyond the previous Sunday evening. The hidden compartment's contents, as described by Mavis, with the careful detail of someone who had examined them thoroughly despite her fear, painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that had been operating under the village's unsuspecting nose for years. Among the documents were detailed records of property transfers, inheritance modifications, and correspondence with London legal firms that suggested a sophisticated fraud operation using St. Mary Mead's peaceful reputation as cover for activities that would shock the community if fully revealed. The jewelry included pieces that matched Lady Ashworth's expensive taste, but also older items of considerable value that suggested a collection accumulated through various means over an extended period. Dr. Haydock's professional examination of some items that Mavis had nervously brought to him revealed additional disturbing details about the scope of the criminal enterprise. Several documents bore official seals and signatures that appeared genuine, but dated from periods when the supposed signatories had already died, indicating either sophisticated forgery or corruption within the legal system itself. The discovery of detailed plans for identity theft and inheritance fraud, complete with instructions for researching deceased individuals whose identities could be safely assumed, demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond simple village mischief. Inspector Slack's systematic search of the church, conducted with Reverend Clement's shocked permission and the assistance of specialists from Scotland Yard, uncovered additional evidence that transformed the investigation from a missing person case into something approaching a major criminal conspiracy. The compartment had been designed by someone with professional knowledge of concealment techniques, while the careful organization of its contents suggested regular use by individuals who understood the importance of maintaining detailed records for complex fraudulent schemes. Most significantly, the discovery of correspondence between someone identified as C.B. and various criminal associates provided the missing link between Lady Ashworth's troubled past and her apparently respectable present in St. Mary Mead. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence with the careful attention she had learned to apply to complex problems involving human nature and criminal deception. The convergence of the false solicitor's knowledge, Miss Blacklock's obvious anxiety, the hidden church repository, and Lady Ashworth's mysterious past suggested a web of relationships and secrets that had been carefully maintained until something had gone catastrophically wrong. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had been not merely a victim of circumstances, but possibly a participant in schemes that had finally caught up with her, though Miss Marple suspected that the full truth would prove even more complex than the evidence currently suggested. The sixth day dawned with a kind of crisp October clarity that made every detail of St. Mary Mead stand out with unusual sharpness, as if the village itself were preparing for the revelation of truths that had been hidden in its shadows for far too long. Inspector Slack arrived early with additional officers from Scotland Yard, their systematic approach to the expanded investigation creating an atmosphere of official gravity that transformed the quiet village into something resembling a crime scene from a sensational novel. Miss Marple observed their methodical work from her strategic position in the memorial garden, her knitting needles moving steadily through the pale blue wool, while her sharp eyes noted the small details that official procedures might overlook in their focus on dramatic evidence and obvious conclusions. The morning brought Julian Rivers back to St. Mary Mead, his release from custody having been prompted by the discovery that his distinctive cufflink had been planted in the vestry garden by someone with access to his personal effects and detailed knowledge of his financial difficulties. His obvious relief at being cleared of suspicion was tempered by the humiliating awareness that he had been used as a convenient scapegoat by criminals sophisticated enough to manipulate both evidence and public opinion to serve their own purposes. His account of the false solicitor's careful questioning about village records and parish registers provided additional confirmation that the criminal conspiracy had been operating with inside knowledge of local procedures and personalities. Miss Blacklock's arrest following Inspector Slack's discovery of incriminating correspondence hidden in her cottage, finally provided the key to understanding the complex network of relationships that had brought tragedy to their peaceful community. Her position as postmistress had given her access to information about deaths, inheritances, and family circumstances throughout the region, intelligence that she had been systematically selling to criminal organizations in exchange for substantial payments that had funded her comfortable retirement. The revelation that she had been using her trusted position to facilitate fraud and identity theft sent shockwaves through the village, forcing residents to reconsider their assumptions about people they had known and respected for decades. The scope of the criminal enterprise became clear as investigators pieced together evidence from multiple sources, revealing a sophisticated operation that had been using St. Mary Mead as a base for activities spanning several counties and involving numerous victims whose deaths had been carefully researched and exploited. Lady Ashworth's role in this conspiracy remained unclear, but the evidence suggested that she had been attempting to escape from, rather than participate in the criminal activities, seeking refuge in the village's peaceful reputation while gathering evidence that could expose her former associates. Her careful documentation of criminal methods and financial records, discovered hidden in various locations around Rose Cottage, indicated someone who had been preparing to testify against dangerous individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Miss Marple's quiet investigation had revealed patterns of behavior and small inconsistencies that the official inquiry had initially overlooked in its focus on obvious suspects and dramatic evidence. Her understanding of human nature had led her to recognize the artificial quality of the crime scene staging, the careful manipulation of public opinion, and the sophisticated psychological techniques used to misdirect the investigation away from the true perpetrators. The theatrical discovery of evidence, the convenient appearance of the false solicitor, and the almost perfect timing of various revelations had all pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures and criminal psychology. The hidden church compartment's significance extended far beyond its use as a document repository, serving as a meeting point and coordination center for criminal activities that had been operating under the cover of religious respectability for an extended period. The discovery of detailed maps marking the locations of wealthy elderly residents, along with notes about their family circumstances and potential vulnerabilities, revealed the systematic nature of the targeting process that had claimed numerous victims across the region. Most disturbing was the evidence of corruption within official institutions, including forged documents bearing genuine seals and signatures that could only have been obtained through inside sources within the legal and administrative systems. As the investigation entered its final phase, Miss Marple recognized that the truth behind Lady Ashworth's disappearance involved not just individual criminal acts, but a comprehensive assault on the trust and security that formed the foundation of village life. The criminals had succeeded in turning St. Mary Mead's greatest strengths, its sense of community, its respect for authority, and its assumption of good faith among neighbors, into weapons that could be used against its own residents. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had been caught in a web of deception that stretched far beyond their quiet village, and her fate would serve as a reminder that evil could flourish even in the most unlikely places when good people failed to recognize the signs of its presence among them. The seventh morning brought with it an atmosphere of expectation that Miss Marple recognized from long experience with human nature under stress, as if the village itself were holding its breath before the final revelation of truths that had been carefully concealed beneath its placid surface. Inspector Slack's continued frustration with the false solicitor's complete disappearance had led him to focus increasingly on the obvious suspects, but Miss Marple's methodical review of the accumulated evidence had revealed patterns that pointed toward someone whose involvement had been so subtle as to escape official notice entirely. Her morning visit to the church, ostensibly to examine Mrs. Price's harvest arrangements one final time, provided her with the opportunity to confirm the suspicions that had been growing in her mind since the discovery of the metallic scent on Lady Ashworth's prayer book. a detail that had seemed insignificant until she realized its true implications. The distinctive aroma that had lingered on the prayer book was not the standard brass polish used throughout the church, but rather the expensive silver polish that she had encountered only once before in St. Mary Mead, during her visit to Mr. Wither's immaculate cottage, where every surface gleamed with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of professional pride and obsessive attention to detail. Mr. Wither's position as the late Sir Reginald Ashworth's solicitor had provided him with intimate knowledge of the family's financial affairs, including the precise value of the inheritance and the existence of the estranged nephew whose identity could be conveniently assumed by someone with the legal expertise to forge the necessary documentation. His quiet presence throughout the investigation, offering helpful insights while remaining carefully in the background, now struck Miss Marple as the behavior of someone monitoring the progress of an inquiry he'd carefully orchestrated from the beginning. Her afternoon encounter with Mr. Wither in the village library was arranged with the casual precision that had served her well in previous investigations, creating an opportunity for private conversation under circumstances that would seem perfectly natural to any observer. Miss Marple's gentle questions about local history and church artifacts gradually led to the subject of silver polish and its distinctive properties, particularly the expensive variety that Sir Reginald Ashworth had insisted upon for his family's antique pieces. Mr. Wither's initial responses maintained his usual composed demeanor, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tension in his posture and the way his eyes avoided direct contact when she mentioned the metallic scent that had puzzled her throughout the investigation. The psychological pressure that Miss Marple applied was subtle but relentless, building through seemingly innocent observations about the precision required for successful impersonation and the intimate knowledge necessary to assume another person's legal identity convincingly. Her casual mention of the silver polish found on the vestry crucifix, combined with her gentle speculation about its connection to the Ashworth family's preferences, created visible cracks in Mr. Wither's carefully maintained facade. His hands, usually steady as befitted a man accustomed to handling important documents, began to tremble almost imperceptibly as Miss Marple continued her quiet dissection of the evening's events with the methodical precision of someone unraveling a complex legal document. The moment of revelation came when Miss Marple produced her knitting and asked Mr. Wither to hold the pale blue wool while she wound it into a proper ball, a simple domestic task that became a subtle interrogation as she continued to speak of timing, opportunity, and the remarkable coincidence of his intimate knowledge of Ashworth family affairs. The wool stretched between his hands created a physical connection that seemed to draw truth from him, despite his obvious desire to maintain his carefully constructed deceptions, while Miss Marple's gentle questions about the false solicitor's sophisticated understanding of inheritance law and probate procedures gradually cornered him with the inexorable logic of accumulated evidence. Mr. Wither's composure finally cracked when Miss Marple mentioned the deliberate arrangement of evidence at both Rose Cottage and the church, suggesting the work of someone who understood both legal procedures and criminal psychology well enough to misdirect an official investigation while achieving personal objectives. His admission came not as a dramatic confession, but as the gradual collapse of defenses that could no longer withstand the weight of Miss Marple's patient accumulation of details, each seemingly insignificant observation building upon the others until the complete picture of his guilt became undeniable even to himself. The revelation that Mr. Wither had been systematically planning Lady Ashworth's elimination for months, using his position as her legal advisor to research her past and identify the vulnerabilities that could be exploited, cast the entire mystery in a new light that explained both the sophisticated planning and the intimate knowledge that had characterized every aspect of the criminal scheme. His access to confidential family documents had allowed him to create the false solicitor persona with convincing authenticity, while his understanding of Lady Ashworth's troubled history had provided the perfect cover for a disappearance that could be attributed to her own criminal associations rather than his calculated greed. Miss Marple's final questions delivered with the gentle persistence that had served her well throughout a lifetime of observing human nature, extracted the complete truth about Lady Ashworth's fate and the elaborate deception that had been constructed to conceal Mr. Wither's systematic theft of the Ashworth inheritance. The silver polish, the carefully staged evidence, and the false solicitor's convenient appearance had all been elements in a complex plan designed to eliminate the rightful heir while providing legal justification for transferring her substantial assets to accounts that Mr. Wither had prepared years in advance, using his professional expertise to create an apparently legitimate framework for what was essentially elaborate murder and theft. As Inspector Slack arrived with his constables, summoned by the prearranged signal that Miss Marple had established before beginning her final confrontation, the village of St. Mary Mead prepared to confront the reality that their most trusted legal adviser had been systematically betraying everything they held sacred. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had been the victim not of mysterious criminal associates from her past, but of the quiet, methodical greed of a man whose professional respectability had provided perfect cover for crimes that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew him only through his public persona. The 8th morning brought resolution to the mystery that had consumed St. Mary Mead for more than a week, as Mr. Wither's complete confession revealed the full scope of his elaborate criminal scheme, and finally provided answers to questions that had puzzled both the official investigation and the village's amateur detectives. Inspector Slack's systematic search of Mr. Wither's cottage, conducted with the methodical thoroughness that the case now demanded, uncovered a treasure trove of forged documents, stolen jewelry, and detailed records that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of his fraudulent activities extending far beyond the Ashworth case to include numerous other victims whose deaths had been systematically exploited over several years. Lady Ashworth's ultimate fate was revealed through Mr. Wither's reluctant admission that she remained alive, though imprisoned in a remote cottage that he had purchased years earlier as a refuge for activities requiring absolute privacy and security. Her rescue by Inspector Slack's officers brought to St. Mary Mead a woman whose ordeal had been far more harrowing than anyone had initially imagined, involving not just physical captivity, but psychological torture designed to break her will and force her cooperation in the legal transfer of her inheritance to accounts that Mr. Wither had prepared with meticulous care. The false solicitor's identity was finally revealed as Mr. Wither himself, using theatrical skills and legal knowledge acquired through decades of professional practice to create a convincing persona that had fooled even experienced investigators. His intimate familiarity with Ashworth family history, combined with his access to confidential legal documents and official seals, had allowed him to present himself as a legitimate representative while systematically misdirecting the investigation toward convenient scapegoats like Julian Rivers and away from his own carefully concealed involvement. Miss Blacklock's role in the conspiracy proved to be more complex than initially suspected, involving not active participation in Mr. Wither's schemes, but rather passive cooperation born of fear and financial desperation that had made her vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation. Her knowledge of Lady Ashworth's troubled past had been exploited by Mr. Wither to provide additional credibility for theories about criminal associates and mysterious disappearances, while her position as retired postmistress had given her access to information about local residents that proved valuable for identifying potential victims. The hidden church compartment's true purpose was revealed as a repository, not for ongoing criminal activities, but for evidence that Mr. Wither had been accumulating against his various victims, insurance policies that could be used to ensure their cooperation or silence their protests if his schemes were discovered. The sophisticated organization of these materials demonstrated the methodical nature of his criminal enterprise, which had been operating successfully for years under the cover of his professional respectability and the trust automatically accorded to a village solicitor. Dr. Haydock's medical examination of Lady Ashworth revealed the physical and psychological trauma she had endured during her captivity, though her remarkable resilience and determination to see justice done provided hope for her eventual recovery from an ordeal that would have destroyed a less courageous individual. Her detailed account of Mr. Withers' systematic attempts to force her cooperation through a combination of legal manipulation and physical intimidation painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators accustomed to dealing with criminal behavior. The village's reaction to these revelations reflected the profound impact of discovering that someone they had trusted implicitly had been systematically betraying that trust for personal gain, forcing residents to reconsider their assumptions about the nature of evil and its ability to flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Colonel Bantry declared himself thoroughly disgusted by the entire affair, while Mrs. Price admitted that her confidence in her ability to judge character had been severely shaken by the realization that Mr. Withers' apparent respectability had concealed such calculated malevolence. Reverend Clement's role in the mystery proved to be entirely innocent. His confused memory of seeing Lady Ashworth during the final blessing having been the result of Mr. Withers' deliberate manipulation of lighting and positioning designed to create the illusion that she had remained in the church throughout the service. This psychological misdirection had been crucial to establishing the timeline that supported Mr. Withers' version of events, demonstrating his sophisticated understanding of both human perception and the predictable patterns of official investigation. Julian Rivers's complete exoneration brought him little satisfaction, as the humiliation of being suspected and the revelation of his financial desperation had destroyed his reputation within the community and forced him to confront the reality that his gambling debts and questionable associations had made him an ideal scapegoat for someone seeking to deflect suspicion from more likely suspects. His departure from St. Mary Mead marked the end of one chapter in the village's recovery from the trauma of discovering how thoroughly they had been deceived. Miss Marple's final visit to Lady Ashworth, conducted in the quiet of her own cottage over properly prepared tea and freshly baked scones, provided both women with an opportunity to reflect on the lessons contained within an experience that had tested their faith in human nature, while ultimately confirming the power of careful observation and patient determination to overcome even the most sophisticated deceptions. Lady Ashworth's decision to remain in St. Mary Mead, despite the traumatic associations it would always hold, demonstrated a courage that impressed even Miss Marple's experienced understanding of human resilience. The mystery's resolution had provided more than just answers to immediate questions about Lady Ashworth's disappearance, revealing deeper truths about the nature of trust, authority, and moral responsibility that would influence the village's character for generations to come. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had ultimately been restored to her rightful place, but the experience had changed both her and the community that had witnessed her ordeal, creating a new awareness of the vigilance required to protect the values that made their way of life worth preserving. As Miss Marple returned to her knitting in the peaceful quiet of her cottage garden, the pale blue wool taking shape under her experienced fingers, she reflected on the eternal struggle between good and evil that played out in countless variations across the human experience. The mystery was solved, justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead would gradually heal from the wounds inflicted by betrayal and deception. But the memory of these events would serve as a permanent reminder that even in the coziest of villages, the darkest secrets could lie hidden beneath the most respectable facades, waiting for a keen eye and a deep understanding of the human heart to bring them finally into the light. 3 weeks after Mr. Withers' arrest, St. Mary Mead moved through its daily routines with the careful deliberation of a community learning to trust again. Miss Marple observed this gradual healing from her cottage window, where the pale blue shawl lay nearly completed across her lap, its soft wool carrying memories of the patient hours spent unraveling motivations far more complex than any knitting pattern. The morning mist still rose from the churchyard with ethereal beauty, but underneath lay a tension that spoke of foundations slowly rebuilding themselves from careful, cautious beginnings. Lady Ashworth's decision to remain in Rose Cottage had surprised many villagers who assumed she would flee the scene of such traumatic memories. Yet her daily walks through the village green demonstrated a quiet courage that gradually won over even the most skeptical observers. Her presence at morning service, though initially awkward for both herself and the congregation, had become a symbol of resilience that impressed Miss Marple considerably. During their afternoon tea visits, Lady Ashworth explained that leaving would feel like surrendering a final victory to Mr. Wither's machinations, allowing his evil to claim not just her peace, but her chosen home as well. The revelation of Mr. Wither's systematic deceptions had forced every resident to confront uncomfortable questions about their own judgment and the ease with which they had been manipulated. Mrs. Price's confidence in organizing community affairs had been severely shaken by discovering that the man she had consulted on numerous parish matters had been systematically betraying everyone who sought his guidance. Her nervous energy now manifested in almost obsessive attention to church activities, as if perfect organization could restore her sense of usefulness and moral certainty. Colonel Bantry's reaction had been characteristically direct, involving a complete review of his legal arrangements and a public declaration that professional credentials would never again substitute for evidence of genuine character. Mrs. Bantry took a more philosophical approach, using the experience to reflect on dangerous assumptions people made based on superficial indicators of respectability. Their evening conversations, overheard during Miss Marple's regular walks, revealed the depth of their shock at being so thoroughly deceived by someone they had considered a trusted friend. Miss Blacklock's situation remained the most delicate aspect of the community's recovery. Her role as unwilling accomplice, driven by fear and blackmail rather than genuine malice, had earned her suspended sentence and community service that allowed her to remain in St. Mary Mead while making amends. Miss Marple's regular visits, bringing small comforts and maintaining social connection, demonstrated the Christian charity she believed essential for genuine healing, though she carefully avoided any appearance of condoning the choices that had enabled serious harm. Dr. Haydock's medical perspective on the community's trauma provided valuable insights into the psychological impact of betrayal on a closely knit society. His observation that the village displayed symptoms similar to individuals recovering from serious trauma helped explain the unusual behaviors and emotional responses that had emerged. The doctor's own admission that he had been completely fooled by the false solicitor's medical knowledge served as a reminder that even trained observers could be manipulated by sufficiently skilled deceivers. The church itself had undergone both physical and spiritual cleansing following the discovery of the hidden compartment. Reverend Clement had led a special service of rededication, attempting to restore the sacred atmosphere violated by criminal activities. The removal of the secret repository required careful stonework that left visible scars in the ancient masonry, permanent reminders of how easily sacred spaces could be corrupted when vigilance failed. New security measures implemented by the parish council reflected a loss of innocence that saddened Miss Marple, though she recognized their necessity. Young Mavis Clegg's transformation from simple village girl to key witness had aged her beyond her years in ways that concerned everyone who cared about her welfare. Her relationship with Sam Durrant had survived the scrutiny following the investigation, but both young people now carried the burden of knowing how easily their innocent romance could have been destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Miss Marple's gentle guidance helped them understand that their traumatic experience had provided valuable insights into truth and deception that would serve them throughout their lives. The broader implications of Mr. Wither's criminal enterprise extended far beyond St. Mary Mead, as Scotland Yard's investigation revealed connections to fraudulent activities in numerous communities where trusted professionals had systematically exploited their positions. The discovery that such sophisticated networks could operate successfully for years under professional respectability had prompted reviews of regulatory systems throughout the legal profession. As November approached with its first frost appearing on the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons contained within the mystery that had disrupted their peaceful community. The experience had strengthened their understanding of the vigilance required to maintain cherished values while demonstrating that ordinary people possessed the wisdom necessary to recognize truth even when carefully concealed behind sophisticated deceptions. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had been restored to her rightful place, but the experience had changed everyone involved in ways that would influence their relationships for years to come. Section 12. The Christmas season arrived in St. Mary Mead with a gentleness that seemed designed to heal autumn's wounds, as if the village itself were determined to demonstrate that goodness could ultimately triumph over calculated deception. Miss Marple observed this seasonal transformation from her cottage window, where her completed pale blue shawl lay folded with satisfaction, its soft wool carrying memories of patient hours spent understanding human motivations far more intricate than any knitting pattern she had ever attempted. Mr. Wither's trial had concluded in November with a conviction that brought justice to the community, but little sense of triumph. The evidence presented in court revealed the full scope of his betrayals in detail that shocked even those who thought they understood his crimes. His systematic exploitation of professional trust had extended beyond financial fraud to emotional manipulation and psychological torture, affecting numerous victims across several counties. The judge's sentencing remarks specifically noted the aggravating factor of his abuse of professional position, imposing a lengthy prison term ensuring he would never again exploit community trust. Lady Ashworth had become a fixture of village life, her active participation in Christmas preparations providing visible proof that trust could be rebuilt even after devastating betrayal. Her decision to establish a charitable foundation using part of her inheritance had provided resources for improvements benefiting future generations while creating positive legacy from traumatic events. Her quiet generosity funded new church security measures, village school improvements, and support for elderly residents vulnerable to exploitation. These contributions were made without fanfare or expectation of recognition, demonstrating genuine humility that won over even the most skeptical villagers. The church restoration project had taken on new meaning following the hidden compartment's discovery, with the community determined to repair both physical damage and spiritual violation within their sacred space. Reverend Clement's leadership throughout this process demonstrated moral courage that Miss Marple believed essential for genuine healing. He refused to allow criminal activities to diminish his faith in parishioners' fundamental goodness, while acknowledging the need for greater vigilance against future deceptions. New stonework, replacing damaged masonry, was carved with symbols of hope and renewal, serving as permanent reminders of community resilience. Young Mavis Clegg's marriage to Sam Durrant took place in December, with the entire village celebrating a union that had survived scrutiny and suspicion following their inadvertent involvement in the mystery. Their wedding served as a symbol of community renewal, demonstrating that love and trust could flourish even after betrayal and deception. Miss Marple's gift of silver teaspoons carried special significance as the young couple understood her message about maintaining domestic virtues that formed genuine community foundations. The mystery's resolution had attracted scholarly attention from criminologists interested in how small communities could protect themselves against sophisticated criminal enterprises while maintaining the openness that made village life worthwhile. Miss Marple's correspondence with researchers provided opportunities to reflect on broader lessons, particularly the importance of balancing healthy skepticism with faith in human goodness that made genuine community possible. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the recovery process identified factors contributing to St. Mary Mead's resilience, including the presence of individuals like Miss Marple, who combined deep local knowledge with ability to recognize behavioral patterns revealing hidden truths. His medical perspective helped the village understand that healing from betrayal required time and patience, But complete recovery was possible when communities maintained commitment to original values. The legal proceedings had prompted new guidelines and oversight procedures preventing similar abuses of professional trust. Miss Marple's testimony had been particularly noted for demonstrating how careful observation and deep understanding of human nature could reveal deceptions that fooled trained investigators. Several law enforcement agencies sought her advice on training programs, helping officers recognize subtle signs of sophisticated criminal deception. As the new year approached and Miss Marple prepared to begin another knitting project, she reflected on the eternal struggle between good and evil that had played out in their quiet village with such dramatic consequences. The lady who had vanished between two prayers had been restored not just to her rightful place, but to fuller understanding of courage required to build genuine community where evil could disguise itself behind respectable facades. The final lesson lay not in dramatic revelations or satisfying resolution, but in demonstrating that ordinary people possessed wisdom and courage necessary to recognize truth even when carefully concealed. Miss Marple's quiet triumph had been achieved through patient application of human understanding and moral courage available to anyone willing to observe carefully and trust their deepest instincts about good and evil. As she settled by her window and picked up needles to begin a new pattern, she carried satisfaction knowing St. Mary Mead would continue thriving as long as residents maintained commitment to simple virtues that had ultimately triumphed over calculated malevolence.